operations in whichever particular area you choose. And so the technology department, which is usually kept in a dark cupboard somewhere, suddenly has this sort of sense of power that it can take over the entire business. And yes, they do need to be kind of integrated right across a company's model. And I think that's something that the smartest companies are getting, but it's going to take a while to, if you like that, there's almost a sense of legacy debt to the structure of all these companies that has to be addressed before you can really take advantage of mobile, which is quite often why we see the startups being able to move faster and to disrupt some of the established players, despite the fact they have the advantage of incumbency. It's kind of partly been like this dilemma model, but it's also, I think, particularly unique and particularly strong in the mobile area.
I actually got a question for both of you guys. First of all, I was just going to say, I mean, having worked in this industry for a few years now, I think that the point at the beginning was to make it seem really complicated and confusing, so that you really needed somebody to help you with it, and fortunately we're the people who can. I think there's the consolidation that's happening in potentially in the areas that you were talking about, Helen, and where, you know, if people can't understand you, then they're probably just going to start going elsewhere, because it's just, you know, we just don't get what you're talking about, so that's it. I was going to ask you though, Carlos and Rafe probably, the disruption of the big players, I mean, the democratization, is that not a bit of a kind of illusion? I've just been reading The Internet Is Not the Answer, controversially, and by Andrew Keane, and some of the stuff around, the internet, up to Tim Berners-Lee was this great cooperative effort, publicly funded, and now it's a winner-takes-all model, and Google and Facebook and everybody like that just seem to be able to hoover up the next startup in order to ensure that they continue to be the behemoths that they've grown to. So do you see that kind of, those great new internet monopolies being smashed by people here at Mobile World Congress?
That's quite a question. In terms of whether the democratization is a false construct, just personally, I think that Andrew Keane may not be the strongest point to argue from, because he's generated quite a business out of his contrarianism. Not to say there might be something correct in what he's saying, but that said, I don't know. I guess would be the best answer. I mean, I think that I understand the point, and that new monopolies and new behemoths, I think that's a really good word to use, are being created. And I think that maybe the bigger issue is we sort of see this kind of cultural monotony emerging, where I think we're losing a lot of, well, not losing is a strong word, but there are a lot of distinct bits of culture that are becoming sort of homogenized by the internet, and I think that's a challenge that we need to address. I've gone a bit sociological, maybe that's not what I wanted, but I think in terms of technology, I still think that we live in a time where companies and startups and innovators and entrepreneurs have greater access to market and to technology and to communication channels than they've ever had before. Some of those may be through companies like Google and Facebook and some of these tech giants, but I mean, I think the sort of saving grace is that for those companies to really try and lock things down is cutting off their nose to spite their face. And I think that if they do try and do that, I don't think it will work, because I think something that the internet has shown it's very good at is finding ways around barriers. Whether that's people in certain countries finding access to services that are presumed, quote unquote, blocked by authorities there. Whether it's, users moving from one service to another because a service did something they didn't like. So I don't think the risk is quite as great as someone maybe like Andrew Keane would have us believe. But I do think it's a legitimate concern, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. I'm just going to pass the mic to Rafe now. Much more airy.
I think trying to add value to what Carlo has said. He's actually put it much better than I could. I think it's sometimes important to separate the corporate structure from what we see as innovation or new businesses. And certainly I think there's a legitimate concern about the scale of Google, Facebook, Apple and all of those. But I would point out, we can look at the history of the mobile industry and see a dominant player can be unseated. Most of the big names now are unrecognisable, but what happened to Nokia, but what happened to Ericsson, and I think that's a continuing pattern.
What was that operating system?
Thank you, Carlo. And I'm not only, similarly with Microsoft in technology, I'm not saying that Facebook and Google and Apple are going to disappear, because I don't think they will, but I wouldn't necessarily have a great concern about them sort of eating smaller companies, because to a certain extent that's actually an artifact of the capitalist system basically, and venture capital is set up to do exits. You have to also see the positive side of that. The amazing access to capital has actually allowed the flowering of technology in a way that's pretty much unprecedented, simply because the overheads and the kind of the externalities of technology are so much lower than any other sector, which is really part of the reason it's been able to accelerate so far. So I think you have to absolutely be concerned about this consolidation, but equally well, that wouldn't have happened in the first place if we hadn't had the environment to let that happen. And I think, to Carlo's point about kind of homogeneity as a result of this, I think we also have to acknowledge that it allows voices to be heard in a way that's pretty unprecedented, and we see startups from all over the world. If you think of things like Skype coming out of Estonia and plenty of others as well, it's going to be really intriguing to see what happens in the next decade as some of the emerging markets come on stream in a way that we haven't seen before, and whether you can see a big startup out of India or China become a global giant, or will they just get bought off. You know, there are certainly founders out there in companies who want to establish their own identity on themselves, but equally there are those that are quite happy to be bought by the big guys. I think those that are really ambitious actually have the ambition to do it on their own, and Mark Zuckerberg got offered, to be bought Facebook back in the day, turned it down, and look what's happened to him now. And so I think it's partly about the mentality of the founders of the companies. It's always tempting to sort of have a slightly Luddite view of the world with regard to technology, and that seems to happen every single era we've been in.
So security, data privacy.
So that's the big what if that really concerns me, because there's so much data being collected now, and if we think about sensors and the capability of the devices in our pockets, far more personal computers, far more data being collected, and people just aren't aware of the implicit contract they're making with these big companies that you get stuff in exchange for giving them data.
Well, it's a split-second decision whether you click on the button to have free Wi-Fi.
Yeah, and people just don't know that Google knows them better than they know themselves, and particularly when you start looking 5 years down the road where we will get to predictive models that will know what you're going to do before you even know yourself. That does concern me, because that level of knowledge is pretty much unprecedented, and there is no regulatory or legal framework set up for that yet. And one of the things we've learned, technology is at its most dangerous when it moves ahead of the kind of the regulatory and the legal framework.
I'll repeat that.
Go on.
I'll let you finish your point, Rafe, but I would like to come back to that.
I kind of finished the point there, but in terms of the quality of access and things like that, that's where I think you have the concern. At the same time, you can't be tied into a framework, because the whole point about a lot of innovation is that it is going to be disruptive, it is going to change things, and actually that's how you make progress. To go back to the Luddite point, you can't be afraid of it, but it probably is I am, but the pace and scale is pretty much unprecedented. I mean, I think that even within my lifetime to know internet, and then it does give me some concern for the future, just how much that might change again.
Yeah. I take Rafe's point regarding government and regulation when it comes to privacy and security. I mean, I think that we've already seen what can happen when when companies or corporate entities are left to sort of do whatever they want. or even what governments
Yeah.
do.
Not saying
You know, I think the issue that I see, you know, when we start having this conversation is that, you know, it's a very fine balance to be struck between a government or a regulatory body acting in a way that protects end users, consumers, the public, without hampering innovation. I think, you know, the way that you phrased it, you know, I may be reading into it something that you're not intending, where, you know, you're saying it's very hard for government to keep up with innovation. I think it's impossible for government, and particularly for politicians, to keep up with innovation. And to get to a point where, you know, there's some sort of implicit regulation of innovation or permission needed to innovate, I think that's something that can really destroy the technological world and really hamper progress.
Absolutely, and just to make it clear, it was more a case of I'm concerned that they're not doing a good enough job, rather than they should regulate that space. It's just rather than being on a product life cycle that lasts, you know, years or months. Actually, regulation tends to be on a decade cycle. Just like to see a change in that. And in general, I want them to get out of the way as much as possible and let the free market have its way. But there are plenty of examples from corporate history where they're not the right one, and whether the government's even the right person to do that regulation might be a question.
Okay, guys, we'll take a break and we'll be back. But I think we're going to go for a while. Thank you for now.